Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We have begun looking at and discussing individual gods and their particular functions, starting with Zeus, and we will now continue by examining Aphrodite, the goddess of love. According to the Theogony, as you will remember, Aphrodite was born in the foam that appeared around Uranos's severed members when Kronos tossed them into the sea. This is one version of her birth story, but according to another, which appears in Book 5 of the Iliad, and which we will examine at the end of this lecture, she is the daughter of Zeus and a goddess named Dione. So, like many other gods, Aphrodite has at least two versions of how she came into existence. Whichever version is followed, she is normally portrayed as a young woman at the high point of her beauty. If Hesiod's version of her myth is followed, however, though, she is actually one of the very oldest of the goddesses. But nevertheless, she is always portrayed as a very young woman. Unlike Hera or Demeter or Hestia, she is always portrayed as a young woman, which of course makes sense given the fact that she is the goddess of love. And as the goddess of love, Aphrodite is extremely powerful. She can and does subdue even Zeus to her will. The only beings she cannot touch are the three virgin goddesses Hestia, Artemis, and Athena. They are immune to Aphrodite, but every other living being, both gods, humans, and animals, are vulnerable to Aphrodite's power. Aphrodite appears in many, many works of literature. In fact, it might almost be safe to say that in most works of ancient literature, there is at least some reference to her. However, for our understanding of her essential nature, we are going to turn to a Homeric hymn as our starting point. Now, the Homeric hymns, or Homerikoi hymnoi, are a collection of 33 anonymous ancient Greek hymns celebrating individual gods. The hymns are Homeric in the sense that they employ the same epic meter, dactylic hexameter, as the Iliad and Odyssey. They use many similar formulas and are couched in the same dialect, while the modern scholarly consensus is that they are not written during the lifetime of Homer himself, who incidentally never existed, but that would be another way of saying that they were not written at the very end of the 8th century. Nevertheless, they in antiquity were uncritically attributed to the person of Homer, and our earliest references to them, which are found in the Greek author Thucydides in Book 3, Chapter 104 of his histories, he refers to them as being authored by Homer, and that label has stuck. The whole collection, as a collection, is Homeric, in the only useful sense that can be put upon a word, said the great classical scholar A.W. Verrall in 1894, which is to say that it has come down labeled as Homer from the earliest times of Greek book literature. The oldest of the hymns were probably written in the 7th century BC, somewhat later than Hesiod and the usually accepted date for the writing down of the Homeric epics. This still places the older Homeric hymns, however, among the oldest monuments of Greek literature, although a few of the hymns that are in the corpus may have been composed at a period later than the 7th and 6th centuries BC. The Homeric hymns, specifically the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, recounts the story of Aphrodite's encounter with a mortal man named Anchises. This meeting is well attested elsewhere in ancient Greek literature and ancient Roman literature, because the son that resulted from this union was Aeneas, the hero of Virgil's Latin epic, the Iliad. This man, Aeneas, was supposedly the ancestor of the entire Roman race. This liaison between Anchises and Aphrodite is also mentioned not just in the Aeneid, but also in Homer's Iliad. However, the Homeric hymn concentrates not on Aeneas, the offspring of this union, rather, although he is mentioned near the end of the poem, but rather the Homeric hymn concentrates on Aphrodite's encounter with Anchises himself. And let us now then read this poem. Muse, tell me the things done by golden Aphrodite, the one from Cyprus, who arouses sweet desire for gods, and who subdues the races of mortal humans, and birds as well, who fly in the sky, as well as all beasts, all those that grow on both dry land and the sea. They all know the things done by the one with the beautiful garlands, the one from Cythera. But there are three whose wits she cannot win over or deceive. The first is the daughter of Aegis-bearing Zeus, bright-eyed Athena, for she takes no pleasure in the things done by golden Aphrodite. What does please her is wars, and what is done by Ares, battles and fighting, as well as the preparation of splendid pieces of craftsmanship. For she was the first to teach mortal humans to be craftsmen, in making war chariots and other things on wheels, decorated with bronze. And she it is who teaches maidens tender of skin inside the palaces the skill of making splendid pieces of craftsmanship, putting it firmly into each one's mind. The second is the renowned Artemis. She is of the golden shafts. Never has she been subdued in love by Aphrodite, lover of smiles, for she takes pleasure in the bow and arrows and the killing of wild beasts in the mountains, as well as lyres, groups of singing dancers, and high-pitched shouts of celebration, also shaded groves in the city of just men. The third one not to take pleasure in the things done by Aphrodite is that young maiden full of a sense of shame, Hestia, who was the firstborn child of Cronos of crooked counsel, as well as the last and youngest, through the will of Zeus, holder of the Aegis. She was the lady who was wooed by Poseidon and Apollo, but she was quite unwilling, and she firmly refused. She had sworn a great oath, and what she said became what really happened. She swore, as she touched the head of her father Zeus, the Aegis-bearer, that she would be a virgin for all days to come, that illustrious goddess, and to her father Zeus gave a beautiful honor as a compensating substitute for marriage. She is seated in the middle of the house, getting the richest portion, and in all the temples of the gods she has a share in the honor. Among all the mortals she is the senior goddess. These are the three that Aphrodite could not persuade in their wits. For as for all the rest, there is nothing that has escaped Aphrodite. None of the blessed gods, nor any of mortal humans. She even led astray the mind of Zeus, the one who delights in the thunder, the one who is the very greatest, and the one who has the very greatest honor as his share. But even his well-formed wits are deceived by her whenever she wants, as she pairs him off with mortal women with the greatest of ease, unbeknownst to Hera, his sister and wife, who is the best among all the immortal goddesses in her great beauty. She was the most glorious female to be born to Cronos of crooked counsel, and to her mother Rhea. And Zeus, the one whose resources are inexhaustible, made her his honorable wife, one who knows the ways of affection. But even upon Aphrodite, Zeus put sweet desire in her heart, desire for a mortal man, so that not even she may go without and get a chance to gloat at all the other gods with her sweet laughter. Aphrodite, lover of smiles, boasting that she can make the gods fall in love with mortal women, who then bear mortal sons to immortal fathers, and how she can make the goddesses be with mortal men. And so Zeus put sweet desire in her heart, desire for Anchises. At that time, Anchises was herding cattle at the steep peaks of Mount Ida, famous for its many springs. To look at him and the way he was shaped was like looking at the immortals. When Aphrodite, lover of smiles, saw him, she fell in love with him. A terrible desire seized her in her wits. She went to Cyprus, entering her temple, fragrant with incense, to Paphos. That is where her sacred precinct is, and her altar, fragrant with incense. She went in and closed the shining doors. Then the Graces bathed her and anointed her with oil, the kind that gives immortality, glistening on the complexion of the gods who last for all time. Immortal it was, giver of pleasures, and it had the fragrance of incense. Then she wrapped all her beautiful clothes around her skin. She was decked out in gold, Aphrodite, lover of smiles. She rushed towards Troy, leaving behind fragrant cypress, making her way with the greatest of ease, high up among the clouds. She arrived at Mount Ida, famous for its many springs, nurturing mother of beasts. She went straight for the herdsman's homestead, up over the mountain. Following her came gray wolves and lions with fierce looks fawning on her. Bears, too, and nimble leopards, who cannot have their fill of devouring deer, came along. Seeing them, she was delighted in her heart, inside her wits, and she put desire where their hearts were, so they all went off in pairs together into shaded nooks. She, in the meantime, came to the well-built shelters and found Anchises left all alone at the herdsman's homestead, that hero Anchises, who had the beauty of the gods. All the other herdsmen went after the herds along the grassy pastures, while she was left all alone at the herdsman's homestead, pacing back and forth, playing tunes on his lyre that pierced the inside. She stood before him, the daughter of Zeus, Aphrodite, looking like an unwed maiden in stature and appearance. She did not want him to notice her with his eyes and be frightened of her. When Anchises saw her, he was filled with wonder as he took note of her appearance and size of length and splendid clothes. For she wore a robe that was more resplendent than the brightness of fire. She had twisted brooches and shiny earrings in the shape of flowers. Around her tender throat were the most beautiful necklaces. Her robe was a thing of beauty, golden, decorated with every sort of design. Like the moon, it glowed all around her, a marvel to behold. Seized with love, Anchises said to her, "Hail, my lady, you who came here to this home, whichever of the blessed ones you are, Artemis or Leto, or golden Aphrodite, or Themis of noble birth, or bright-eyed Athena. Or perhaps you are one of the Graces, you who have come here. They are the ones who keep company with all the gods and are called immortal. Or you are one of those nymphs who range over beautiful groves, or one of those nymphs who inhabit this beautiful mountain and the fountainheads of rivers and grassy meadows. For you on some high peak in a spot with a view going all around, I will set up an altar, and I will perform for you beautiful sacrifices every year as the season comes around. And I wish that you in turn may have a kindly disposed hearts towards me. Grant that I may become a man who is distinguished among the Trojans. Make the genealogy that comes after me become a flourishing one, and make me live a very long life, and see the light of the sun, blessed in the midst of the people, and let me arrive at the threshold of old age." Then Aphrodite, daughter of Zeus, answered him, "Anchises, most glorious of earth-born men, I am no goddess. Why do you liken me to the female immortals? No, I am a mortal. The mother that bore me was a woman. My father is Atreus, famed for his name. Maybe you have heard of him. He rules over all of Phrygia with its strong-walled fortresses. But I know your language as well as my own. The nursemaid who brought me up in the palace was a Trojan. Ever since I was a small child, she brought me up, having taken me from my dear mother. That is why I know your language as well as my own. But then the one of the golden wand, the Argos killer, Hermes, abducted me, taking me from a festival of song and dance in honor of Artemis, the one with the golden arrows. There were many of us nymphs there, maidens worth many cattle as bride price. We were having a good time, and a crowd so large that you couldn't count them was standing around us in a circle. Then it was that the one with the golden wand, the Argos killer, abducted me. He carried me over many fields of mortal humans, and over vast stretches of land, unclaimed and unsettled, where wild beasts, eaters of raw flesh, roam about, in and out of their shaded lairs. I thought that my feet would never again touch the earth, grower of grain. And Hermes, said I, in your bed, the bed of Anchises would be called your lawfully wedded wife, and that I would give you splendid children. But once Hermes pointed this out and made note of it, straightway he went back, that powerful Argos killer, to that separate group, the immortals. I, in the meantime, reached you here, and there is an overpowering compulsion that I have in me. In the name of Zeus, in the name of your parents, I appeal to you as I touch your knees. Your parents must be noble, for base ones could never have conceived such a one as you. Take me, maiden that I am, inexperienced in love, and show me to your father, and to your caring mother, and to your brothers, those born from the same parents. I will not be an unseemly in-law for them, but a seemly one indeed. And send a messenger quickly to the Phrygians, trainers of swift horses, to tell my father and my mother, however much she grieves. They will send you plenty of gold and woven clothing as well. Take these abundant and splendid things as dowry. After you have done so, prepare a lovely wedding feast that gives honor to both humans and immortals." After she had said these things, she put sweet desire in his heart, and Anchises was seized with love. He said these words, calling out to her, "If you are immortal, and if a woman was the mother who gave birth to you, and if Atreus is your father, famed for his name, as you say he is, and if you have come here because of the immortal conductor of souls, Hermes, and if you are to be called my wife for all days to come, then it is impossible for me to refuse, not even if the one who shoots from afar, Apollo himself, takes aim from his silver bow and shoots his arrows that bring misery. Then, O lady, who looks like the gods, I would willingly go down into the palace of Hades below." So saying, he took her by the hand, and Aphrodite, lover of smiles, went along, with her face turned away and her eyes downcast towards the house, all nicely made, which had already been arranged for the Lord, all nicely made with soft covers. And in it lay skins of bears and lions, who roar with their deep voices, which he himself had killed in the lofty mountainsides. And then, by the will of the gods and by fate, he lay next to the immortal female, mortal male that he was. He did not know what it was he did. And when the time comes for herdsmen to drive back to the fold their cattle and sturdy sheep, back from the flowery pastures, then it was that she poured sweet sleep over Anchises, sweet and pleasurable. She, in the meantime, now that her skin was again beautifully covered over, the resplendent goddess stood by the bed and the well-built roof beam. Her head reached that high up, and beauty shone forth from her cheeks, an immortal beauty, the kind that marks the one with the beautiful garlands, the goddess from Cythera. Then she woke him from his sleep, and called out to him, saying, "Rise up, son of Dardanus. Why do you sleep such a sleep without awakening? See if I look like what you noticed when you first saw me with your eyes." So she spoke, and he, fresh out of his sleep, straightway heeded her word. As soon as he saw the neck and the beautiful eyes of Aphrodite, he was filled with fright, and he turned his eyes away in another direction. Then he hid his beautiful face with a cloak, and praying to her, addressed her with winged words. "The first time I ever laid eyes on you, goddess, I knew you were a god, but you did not speak to me accurately. Now I appeal to you by touching your knees. In the name of Zeus, the holder of the Aegis, don't let me become disabled. Don't let me live on like that among humans. Please take pity. I know that no man is full of life, able, if he lays beside immortal goddesses." He was answered by the daughter of Zeus, Aphrodite. "Anchises, most glorious and mortal humans, take heart, and do not be too afraid in your wits. You should have no fear that I would do any kind of bad thing to you, or that any of the other blessed ones would, for you are dear indeed to the gods, and you will have a dear son, who will be king among the Trojans, and following him will be generations after generations for all time to come. His name will be Aeneas, since it was an unspeakable, ainos, pain that took hold of me, grief that I had fallen with a mortal man. And yet of all mortal humans, the closest to the gods by far are those who come from your family line, both in looks and in constitution. Why, there was blonde Ganymede, whom Zeus, the master of counsel, abducted on account of his beauty, so that he may be together with the immortal ones, as wine-pourer for the gods in the palace of Zeus, a wonder to behold, given his share of honor by all the immortals, pouring red nectar from a golden mixing bowl. Tros, Ganymede's father, was gripped in his wits by a grief that is beyond forgetting. He did not know where the miraculous gust of wind took his dear son, abducting him. Tros mourned Ganymede without pause for all days, and Zeus took pity on him. He gave him a compensation for his sons, a set of high-stepping horses, whom the gods used for their travels. These horses Zeus gave Tros as a gift to keep, and Tros was told all the details of what happened at the behest of Zeus by the Argos killer, the conductor of souls. He was told that he, Ganymede, would be immortal and ageless, just like the gods. And when Tros heard the message of Zeus, he no longer lamented, but was happy within his wits. And merrily did he ride around in a chariot drawn by horses, with swift feet as a gust of wind. In much the same way was Tithonus abducted by Eos, the goddess of the dawn, she of the golden embroidery. He too belonged to your family line, looking like the immortal ones. Then she went with a request to the son of Cronos, Zeus of the dark clouds, asking that Tithonus become immortal and live for all days to come. Zeus nodded yes to her, and brought to fulfillment the words of her wish. Too bad that her thinking was disconnected. The lady Eos did not notice in her wits that she should have asked for adolescence and a stripping away of baneful old age. Well, for a while Tithonus held on to adolescence, enjoying Eos, the one with the gold embroidery, the one early born. He lived at the streams of the ocean and the ends of the earth. But when the first strands of gray hair started growing from his beautiful head and his noble chin, then the lady Eos stopped coming to him, and she nourished him, keeping him in her palace with grain and ambrosia, and she gave him beautiful clothes. But when hateful old age was pressing hard on him with all his might, and he couldn't move his limbs, much less lift them up, then in her heart she thought up this plan, a very good one indeed. She put him in her chamber, and she closed the shining doors over him. From there his voice pours out, it seems never to end, and he has no strength at all, for the kind he used to have in his limbs when they could still bend. I would not choose that you, Anchises, be that way amongst the immortal ones, immortal and living for all days to come. If you could only stay the way you are, in looks and constitution, staying alive as my lawfully wedded husband, then pain would not have to envelop me and my sturdy wits. But now wretched old age will envelop you pitilessly, just as it catches up with every man. It is baneful, it wears you down, and even the gods shrink back from it. As for me, I will have a great reproach in the eyes of the immortal ones, a disgrace that will last all days to come without end, all on account of you. My trysts and stratagems with which I used to get all the immortals paired off with mortal women used to be feared by the gods, for my power of mind used to subdue all of them. But now my mouth can never again boast about this among the immortals. I have gone very far off the track in a wretched and inexcusable way. I have strayed from my mind. I got myself a child beneath my girdle from a mortal man. As for the child, the moment he sees the light of the sun, nymphs living in the mountains and wearing low-slung girdles will raise him, nymphs that live on this great and fertile mountain. They associate neither with mortals nor immortals. They live for a long time, and they eat immortal food. They put on a beautiful song and dance, even by the standards of the immortals. They frolic with Selenoi, or with the sharp-sighted Argos killer, laying in the recesses of lovely caves. When they are born, firs and oaks with lofty boughs spring out of the earth, that nurturer of men. Beautiful trees flourishing on high mountains, they stand there pointing to the sky, and people call them the sacred places of the immortal ones. Mortals may not cut them down with iron, but when the fate of death is at hand for them, these beautiful trees become dry to start with, and then their bark wastes away, and then the branches drop off, and at the same time the soul goes out of them, and it leaves the light of the sun. These nymphs will raise my son, keeping him in their company. And when adolescence full of loveliness first takes hold of him, the nymphs will take him here to you and show you your child. As for you, in order that I may tell you in the proper order everything that I have in my wits, I too will come back to you as the 5th anniversary approaches, bringing you your son. And the moment you see this young seedling Aeneas with your eyes, you will be happy to look at him, for he will be very godlike, and straightway you will take him to windy Ilion. And if any mortal human asks you, what mother got your dear son beneath her girdle, keep in mind to tell him as I command you. Say that he is the offspring of one of the flower-faced nymphs who live on this beautiful mountain, shaded over by forests. But if you say out loud and boast with a heart bereft of wits that you, his mother, is the lady of Cythera, that the one with the beautiful garlands, then Zeus in his anger will smite you with a smoking thunderbolt. Now then, everything has been said to you. You take note in your wits and refrain from naming me. Avoid the wrath of the gods. So saying, she bolted towards the windy sky. Okay, let us now give some analysis of this. The hymn begins by stating that Zeus was angry at Aphrodite for causing him and the other gods to become romantically involved with humans. Zeus resents this, we are told, and therefore decides to give Aphrodite a taste of her own medicine, so to speak. One implication of this has to do with the idea that the gods have separate spheres of influence. Normally in Greek myth, the gods do not trespass on one another's domains. Aphrodite does not cause earthquakes, for instance. Poseidon does not imbue people with romantic feelings. Hermes does not shoot arrows that kill people suddenly, as we'll see Apollo does. The gods, therefore, tend by and large to respect one another's separate spheres of influence. This respecting of the boundaries of influence probably has to do with the fact that these gods embody or personify the emotions and activities they govern. In other words, there is a sense in which Aphrodite is romantic love. She is romantic love given a visible, tangible body. Zeus as the ruler of the gods, has the ability, though the hymn doesn't explain how, to turn Aphrodite's powers against her and inspire Aphrodite with passion for the young Trojan prince Anchises. This happens in the generation before the Trojan War, a subject that we will be looking a lot more into in time. Anchises in this poem is a young man, though at this point he is an old man during the Trojan War. But Aphrodite appears before Anchises in the disguise as of a young girl, and tells him that she is destined to be his bride. Gods and goddesses can and do appear in any form they choose in Greek myth. Demeter, we will see in time, appears in the Homeric hymn to Demeter before a woman named Metanera as an old woman. Here in this poem, Aphrodite disguises herself as a young girl, just at the age of marriage, which in Greek culture, generally speaking, would be about the age of 14. She tells Anchises that Hermes had picked her up in her own native land and literally carried her to where Anchises is and put her down in front of him. She tells him that he is supposed to marry her. Anchises recognizes from Aphrodite's extraordinary beauty that she must be a goddess, and the first thing he says to her is to ask her for appropriate blessings. However, once she lies to him and says that she is a human being, he allows himself to be persuaded because she is so beautiful, and he allows himself to think that she really is a human being. The first thing he says to Aphrodite when he sees her embodies an idea that is very central in Greek culture, and as we're going to learn, it is actually one of the maxims engraved at the Oracle of Delphi, and that is the maxim, know thyself, and nothing in excess. These are two maxims that we are going to learn about in time. Anchises both remembers his own status as a human and is careful not to ask for excessive blessings from this goddess. And he is sure that she is a goddess who has appeared to him. And he looks at her and says, "Hail, my lady, you who come here to this home, whichever of the blessed ones you are, Artemis or Leto or golden Aphrodite or Themis of noble birth or bright-eyed Athena." And then he goes on to name several other goddesses just to make sure not to insult anyone. We know that this was actually a feature of Greek pagan religion, that they would kind of go through like a list of all the different names that the gods, particular gods, wanted to be called by, so as not to miss anything. And there would usually be something at the end of it, and by any other name that you want to be called. And then he goes on to name several other goddesses just to make sure not to leave anyone out. And says the following thing: "For you on some high peak, in a spot with a view going all around, I will set up an altar, and I will perform for you beautiful sacrifices every year as the season comes around. And I wish that you in turn have a kindly disposed heart towards me. Grant that I may become a man who is distinguished among the Trojans. Make the genealogy that comes after me become a flourishing one, and make me live a very long life and see the light of the sun, blessed in the midst of the people, and let me arrive at the threshold of old age." This particular prayer is really the perfect embodiment of what in the ancient Greek view is appropriate for a human being to ask for. He doesn't ask for 20 or 25 children. He just asks for flourishing children, offspring who will survive after him. He doesn't ask for a lifespan of 200 years. He just asks to reach the threshold of old age. He doesn't ask for exceptional riches. He just asks to be prosperous. He is doing essentially just what he ought to be doing, honoring the gods and asking for appropriate blessings to his status as a human being. Anchises' adherence to these maxims that we're going to see when we learn about Apollo are inscribed at Delphi, the shrine of Apollo. Nothing too much, and know thyself. His adherence to these things, however, and his ability to know himself and to avoid excess, do not protect him. Aphrodite lies to him in order to get her own way, despite the fact that she knows it will have bad consequences for him. Aphrodite persuades Anchises that she is indeed a human being, and as I said, tells him that he is supposed to marry her. After she has persuaded him that she really is a human, Anchises ultimately falls asleep. Aphrodite wakes him up by revealing herself to him as a goddess. She doesn't reveal herself to him in her fully true form, of course, otherwise he would be incinerated. But she does show him enough of her divine glory that it is quite clear that she is not a human being. For instance, her head, we are told, brushes the roof beam of the building that they're in. And she asks him, "Do I look the same as I looked before?" Anchises is terrified when he realizes what she has done, and he asks for mercy in very interesting words. Let's read them again. The first time I ever laid eyes on you, goddess, I knew you were a god, but you did not speak to me accurately. Now I appeal to you by touching your knees in the name of Zeus, the holder of the Aegis. Don't let me become disabled. Don't let me live on like that among humans. Please take pity. I know that no man is full of life able if he lays with immortal goddesses. In other words, the man who lies with immortal goddesses is not left unharmed. And that is an interesting statement with important implications for our understanding of the hymn and, again, for our wider understanding of the ancient Greek culture that developed these myths. Gods and mortals do and can and do interbreed, and their offspring are human, but they're usually exceptional humans, more beautiful, more noble, braver, something like that. More of all of those good things than everyday humans. While mating with a god often has disastrous consequences for a human woman, it does not inevitably lead to disaster. Inevitably. There are stories of mortal women who bear children to gods and continue to live perfectly normal, uneventful, and even happy lives. We will learn, for instance, about the mother of Hercules, Alcmene. She would be an example of such a woman. When Anchises says that a man who lies with an immortal goddess is not left unharmed, he is not stating a principle that holds for all humans in general, but he's talking specifically about mortal men who mate with female divinities. There must be something about that particular combination that comprises a very great transgression. When a god and human mate in Greek myth, a child always results. There was even a proverb about that in ancient Greek, which is usually translated as something along the lines of, the unions of the gods are always fruitful. When a god and human mate, there is always a child conceived without exception. Again, the gender of the two partners is significant. Which one is the human and which one is the god is important here. If the female is the human, then there is no inherent problem with her conceiving a child to a god. Her child will be greater than he would otherwise have been. And I say he because it is almost always a he. Sometimes it is a she. There is Helen of Troy, who was the offspring of the mortal woman Leda, and Zeus, disguised in the form of a swan. But usually the child of a god and a human mother is male. A human mother gets a child who is more glorious and better in most regards than the child would otherwise have been. But what about a goddess bearing a human child? What about the idea that Aphrodite will now be pregnant with a human baby and will give birth to a mortal child, will bear a son who will live for a time and then die? This is seen as degrading, as we read in this myth, as beneath a goddess's dignity. In fact, in the hymn, Aphrodite literally, specifically talks to Anchises about this. She tries to reassure him. She says she won't be harmed as long as he doesn't, he won't be harmed as long as he doesn't tell anyone who the mother of the son is. She says once this child is born, she will bring him to Anchises, leave him with Anchises, and Anchises must not tell that Aphrodite is his mother. Aphrodite puts this in very strong terms. She says that she will name the child Aeneas, which, as we saw, is related to the term for grief, ainos, because of the fact that great grief has seized her over the fact that she has been with a mortal. And she puts it in terms that seem to indicate that she is disgusted with the idea already very quickly. Aphrodite's attempt to reassure Anchises falls very flat, though, because she tells him, as the main thread of her attempt to reassure him, she tells him the story of his kinsman, Tithonus. She says, your family has always been particularly appealing to the gods. We really like you, the Trojan royal family. Remember Tithonus, a kinsman of yours, and the goddess of dawn, Eos, or this would be Aurora in Latin. So to try to reassure Anchises that he need not worry about being harmed, she recounts this story, but it is really a horrifying story. I'll just tell it you quickly right now. Eos, or as I said in Latin, Aurora, the goddess of the dawn, had a relationship with the human Tithonus. She wanted to keep him around because she enjoyed having him around so much, and so she wanted to make him immortal, and she asked Zeus to give him immortality, and which he did. However, she forgot to make him ageless. Okay, remember the gods are Athanatos and Ageratos. Tithonus lives forever. Tithonus cannot die, but He grows older and older and older, eventually, to the point where there is really nothing left of him except a voice, a complaining voice, which Eos shuts away in a back chamber of her palace, so she won't have to pay any more attention to him. And there is a great English poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson in the 19th century, a kind of dramatic monologue of Tithonus as he's an old man, a very, very old man, lamenting his fate. I'll just give you the first few lines here. The woods decay and fall. The vapors weep their burthen to the ground. Man becomes and tills the field and lies beneath. And after many a summer dies the swan. Only cruel immortality consumes me. As reassuring stories go, this one is remarkably unreassuring. It also is a very good example of a theme that occurs over and over in Greek myth. The idea that humans may desire immortality, but that is actually not a possibility for them. And whenever a person tries to get at immortality, something bad always happens. In Greek myth, humans are just not that kind of creature. Humans are, by definition, the thnatoi, the mortals, those who die. There are various stories about humans who attempt to gain immortality, and it almost always, results in total disaster. Tithonus is one of the worst examples because he gets older and older without ever actually dying. But there are similar stories. There is one about a female lover of Apollo, the Sibyl, who, when she was in Apollo's good graces, asked for many years of life, as many as there are grains of sand on the seashore. And this was granted to her, but eternal youth was again left out. And when the Sibyl angered Apollo, he intentionally kept eternal youth back from her. So she too grows older and older. In myth, she will never die. Well, I'm sorry, no, I take that back. She will eventually die, right? Because the grains of sand are finite. So at some point she will die, although it will take a very, very long time. But there are stories about her in which she has withered away into a little thing that sits in a cage, and children go by and torment her, asking her, "Sibyl, what do you want?" And the only answer she gives is, "I want to die." So there are many very grim stories indeed in Greek mythology about the attempt to get immortality. Aphrodite, as I've said before, tells Anchises he won't be harmed if he keeps the secret of who Aeneas' mother actually is. However, the hymn seems to imply that Anchises did tell someone, because the hymn itself exists, and also other stories tell us that Anchises did reveal Aphrodite to be his son's mother, and that he was in fact harmed. He was lamed, crippled, after his encounter with Aphrodite. Aphrodite, though this is not the only relationship she has with human lovers, most notably the mortal Adonis, who was also killed because of his romance with Aphrodite. This myth is similar to myths associated with the ancient Near Eastern goddess Astarte or Ishtar, but the point with whom Aphrodite is often likened. But the point here to stress is that mortal men are typically harmed by romances with goddesses, and this idea is reiterated over and over again in almost every circumstance in which such a relationship occurs. We can just read that story of Venus and Aphrodite very quickly, just an excerpt from it. Then a most beautiful child, then a boy, now a man, now more beautiful than he was before, now enters Venus herself. Venus, of course, is the Latin for Aphrodite. This is from Ovid, who is a Latin author. And the boy being referred to here is Adonis. For while the boy, Cupid, with quiver on shoulder, was kissing his mother, he innocently scratched her breast with a loose arrow. The injured goddess pushed her son away, but the wound he had given her was deeper than it seemed, and deceived her at first. Now captured by mortal beauty, she cares no more for Cythera's shores, nor visits Paphos, surrounded by its deep waters, nor Cnidus, the haunt of fish, nor Amathus, rich in mines. These are all shrines of Aphrodite. She even forgoes the heavens, preferring Adonis to heaven. She holds him and is his companion, and though she is used to always idling in the shade, and by cultivating it, enhancing her beauty, she roams mountain ridges and forests and thorny cliff sides, her clothing caught up to the knee like Diana. And she cheers on the hounds, chasing things safe to hunt, hares flying headlong, stags with deep horns or their hinds. She avoids the strong wild boars, the ravening wolves, and shuns the bears armed with claws. and the lions glutted with the slaughter of cattle. She warns you, Adonis, as if it were ever effective to warn, to fear them too, saying, be bold when they run, but bravery is unsafe when faced with the brave. And do not be foolish, beware of endangering me, and do not provoke the creatures nature has armed, lest your glory is to my great cost. Neither youth nor beauty, nor the charms that affect Venus affect lions, or bristling boars, or the eyes and minds of other wild creatures. Boars have the force of a fierce lightning bolt in their curving tusks, and so does the attack of tawny lions in their huge anger. The whole tribe are hateful to me. She warned him, and made her way through the air, drawn by harnessed swans. But his courage defied the warning. By chance his dogs, following a well-marked trail, roused a wild boar from its lair, and as it prepared to rush from the trees, Cinyras, his grandson, caught it a glancing blow. Immediately the fierce boar dislodged the blood-stained spear with its crooked snout and chased the youth, Adonis, who was scared and running hard. It sank its tusk into his groin and flung him dying on the yellow sand. Cytherea, that's Aphrodite, Venus, carried in her light chariot through the midst of the heavens by her swan's swiftness, had not yet reached Cyprus. She heard from afar the groans of the dying boy, and turned the white birds towards him. When from the heights she saw the lifeless body lying in its own blood, she leapt down, tearing her clothes and tearing at her hair as well, and beat at her breast with fierce hands, complaining of the fates. And yet not everything is in your power, she said. Adonis, there shall be an everlasting token of my grief, and every year an imitation of your death will complete a reenactment of my mourning. But your blood will be changed into a flower. Persephone, you were allowed to alter a woman's body, Menthes to fragrance mint. Shall the transformation of my hero, the blood of Cinyras, be grudged to me? So saying, she sprinkled the blood with odorous nectar, and at the touch it swelled up as bubbles emerge in yellow mud. In less than an hour, a flower of the color of blood was created, such as pomegranates carry, that hide their seeds under a tough rind. But enjoyment of it is brief, for lightly clinging and too easily fallen, the winds deflower it, which are likewise responsible for its name, windflower or anemone. A beautiful story. Looking at Aphrodite, as she is presented in the Homeric hymn, we can isolate the following characteristics of romantic passion as she represents it. Romantic passion is seen as an external force, something that comes swooping in from the outside. It grabs a person, makes them crazy, and makes them do things they normally wouldn't do. It is also seen as being, by nature, transitory. This is not a lasting, emotionally significant force that Aphrodite inflicts on gods and humans. It is a transitory madness. It is not love in the true sense. And I use the word madness here deliberately because it is often described that way in Greek literature, as madness or sickness. The transitoriness of it is one of the main identifying characteristics, in fact. A person may feel romantically for one person one day or 1 year, and then the next year, or even the next day, next week, whatever it may be, they might feel it for someone entirely different. The idea that many modern-day Westerners have, that romantic attraction is a lasting emotional state on which, for instance, a marriage can and should be based, would have struck the ancient Greeks, I think, as rank insanity, as foolishness. The idea that romantic passion could be stable and last enough to base a marriage on simply is not present in any ancient literature. And in fact, one of the clearest articulations of the Greek view of romantic passions happens to be from the single complete poem that has come down to us by the ancient Greek author Sappho, one of the few female writers that we know of from antiquity, and who is in the modern world probably the most famous and in some ways the most interesting of the Greek lyric poets. And this one poem is all about Aphrodite, so it is a perfect poem to read for us. But before I do, just let me give you a little bit of background on the author of Sappho herself. She was born on the Greek island of Lesbos around 630 BC, and her collected poems filled 9 books. And by books, we of course mean 9 papyrus scrolls that would have been prepared in an edition by the Alexandrian librarians in antiquity. Sappho's reputation in antiquity was higher than that of any other female author, and higher than that of many male authors. She was referred to, for instance, as the 10th muse. You recall that the 9 muses are the goddesses of intellectual and creative activity, poetry, history, astronomy, and so forth. So to call Sappho the 10th muse is extraordinarily high praise. It puts her on a level with those other 9 goddesses of creative activity. And in the 1st century AD, the Greek literateur Longinus said of Sappho, quote, are you not amazed at how she evokes soul, body, hearing, tongue, sight, skin, as though they were external and belonged to someone else, and how at one and the same time she both freezes and burns, end quote. Unfortunately, we know very, very little about her. The fragments of her poetry seem to give us a few biographical details. We also have biographical information about her, but it's from much later sources, centuries later indeed, and the details are often contradictory. So we really don't know much about her at all beyond that she was born on the island of Lesbos. She was probably married. She apparently had a daughter, and you can see even how I'm qualifying even the little bit that we do know about her, and she may have spent some time in Sicily. However, despite the meagerness of our information, speculation about the details of Sappho's life has become has been, since antiquity really, not just become, but since antiquity, very, very common. Now, in part, this is because of Sappho's gender. Female authors were extraordinarily rare in the ancient world. They just didn't really happen. And so for a female author to have the status that Sappho achieved, to be considered one of the greatest poets that ever lived, and she was definitely one of the canon of 9 lyric poets that the scholars of Alexandria gave their imprimatur to as the greats of lyric poetry. This obviously raised interest and speculation. What kind of woman was she? What kind of details of her biography might explain why she was able to achieve this status when so few women could? Such speculation about the details of her life has also owed a great deal to the erotic nature of most of her poetry, a fact that around the year 180 AD earned her the rebuke of a Christian writer named Tatianus, as he referred to her contemptuously as a, quote, gunaion pornikon erotomanes, which basically translates to a lewd nymphomaniac. In particular, modern readers tend to assume that Sappho was a lesbian in our sense of the word, in our modern sense of that word. In fact, our modern sense of that term comes from Sappho. That is, it comes from the fact that she was born on the island of Lesbos. And in antiquity, she was simply referred to as the lesbian poet, though originally this simply meant a geographical designation. A lesbian poet was simply a poet from the island of Lesbos, like a Sicilian poet would be one who came from Sicily, and so on. However, because so much of Sappho's poetry is centered around themes of romantic love, and because it was written by a woman, and it was written about women, it strikes modern sensibilities as homoerotic, and therefore the term lesbian has come to mean what it does for us, rather than being a purely geographical designation. Now, I stress the term modern sensibilities here, because surprisingly, at least surprisingly to many in the modern age, in antiquity, ancient authors do not seem to have assumed that Sappho was a lesbian in our sense of the word. In fact, quite to the contrary, we have many references in ancient Greek comedies, that is, to ancient comedies written from the area around Athens, that referred to Sappho's voracious romantic attraction to men, even her promiscuity with men and not with women. In fact, there is an entire tradition that almost is definitely apocryphal, but that is, it is not probably true, but it does show how she was regarded. And this tradition says that she committed suicide over the unrequited love of a man named Phaon. That is, she was so madly in love with him, and when he rejected her, she jumped off a cliff. And if you would like to read the finest literary specimen of this tradition, it is the poem Heroides 15 by the Latin poet Ovid. Now, her poems undoubtedly do praise the beauty of other females, and they do so even in terms that are explicitly amatory. But the question is, how much of this is conventional rather than personal? In other words, simply because Sappho writes what appears to be in an amatory fashion about women, is it safe to assume that she herself had felt those feelings, and it is not just conventional for that type of poetry? This is not so straightforwardly this is not so straightforward a matter as most moderns would have it. Consider, for instance, that these types of amatory elements in lyric poetry were demanded by the genre and can be satisfactorily explained away purely on those grounds. That is, and that point is not even to consider the age-old capacity of any author to speak using a literary persona which need not have any similarity to the author himself. For instance, to use a modern analogy, Johnny Cash never shot a man in Reno, nor did hard time in Folsom Prison, though he says he did in his music. Or to put it in the words of another poet from antiquity, the Latin poet Catullus, who himself was a huge admirer of Sappho, and who translated one of her poems into Latin, nam costum esse decet pium poetam ipsum, versiculos nihil neces est. A genuine poet must himself be chaste, but it is not necessary that his verses be so. In specific regard to Greek poetry, we have examples of what are called partheneia, or maiden songs. That is, choral lyrics written for girls' choruses to sing, which were written by male poets, and in these poems, the singers address one another in explicitly amatory terms, both praising one another's beauty and speaking about one another's romantic attractiveness. Now, either we have to assume that these choruses of girls for whom these poems were written were all lesbians in our sense of the term, and that the male poets knew it and therefore wrote songs commensurate for these girls. Or, what is much more likely, an alternative, we have to assume that there was a convention in which young women praised the beauty of other women without the assumption being made that those girls were themselves attracted to one another. Additionally, since it is likely that several of Sappho's poems seem to have been intended for some such choral performances as I've just described, and if that is the case, then we really do have to bear in mind the possibility that what strikes us moderns as intensely felt personal emotion or as details of personal biography could merely be conventional, stereotyped, something that in her own culture would have been immediately recognized as conventional, as a kind of conventional expression of personal emotion. And this is something that we really do have to bear in mind when reading any poetry at all, but particularly Sappho. And therefore, the mere fact that Sappho wrote poetry praising other women's beauty is not in itself evidence for her sexual orientation, however undeniable it may be that she did write poetry that, as I say, to modern sensibilities sounds clearly as if she's talking about talking about things that are very suggestive of that. Consider, for example, poem 31. They all have numbers. It's fragment 31. This is the same poem that Catullus, who I've just mentioned, translated into Latin. And just listen, read the English with me, and you'll see that there is tremendous ambiguity as to what it might mean. That man seems to be equal to the gods, who is sitting opposite you and hears you nearby speaking sweetly and laughing delightfully, which indeed makes my heart flutter in my breast. For when I look at you, even for a short time, it is no longer possible for me to speak, but it is as if my tongue is broken, and immediately a subtle fire has run over my skin. I cannot see anything with my eyes, and my ears are buzzing. A cold sweat comes over me, trembling seizes me all over. I am paler than grass, and I seem nearly to have died. But everything must be endured. And then the poem breaks off. Now, nearly all readers nowadays interpret these lines to mean that the power of the woman's beauty and her amatory attractiveness to the speaker is what is causing all the physical symptoms described here. But, as the scholar Dennis Page pointed out nearly 80 years ago, it is just as possible to interpret these lines as being passionate jealousy and irritation on the part of the speaker against the female addressee, because the latter is talking to the man the speaker longs for. This especially in light of the last fragmentary line, all must be endured. Sappho's poems, therefore, and what is left of them, strike us as intensely personal, and they read as though they are sincere outpourings of individual emotion. And so it is extremely tempting to assume that these poems did indeed reflect actual circumstances of the poet's life, particularly when we know so little about her and her life, and we want to know so much, such that when she begins a poem with the line, quote, "I have a beautiful daughter," end quote, we really want to believe that that is Sappho telling us directly, "I have a beautiful daughter." But it is a fragment, and we don't know who was speaking those lines. We don't know if that really reflects the actual Sappho or not. Part of the problem we have in evaluating the exact tone of Sappho's erotic addresses to other women and the content of the rest of her work as well, since she did write poetry that has no amatory dimensions to it, is, as I said, that we have so very, very little left of it. In fact, of 9 books of poetry that we know she wrote, her 9 papyrus scrolls, we have only one complete poem, usually called the Hymn to Aphrodite, and it is to this poem that I want now to turn, and to reconnect with the overarching topic of this lecture, which is about Aphrodite. This poem, the Hymn to Aphrodite, was quoted in its entirety by a later, though still ancient author, a man with the wonderful name of Dionysius of Halicarnassus. There's a real mouthful for you, who found this poem so beautiful, so lovely, that he quoted the entire poem in an essay that he was writing, De Compositione Verborum, or On the Composition of Words. He lived in the 1st century BC, some 600 years after Sappho's own day. He said that this poem's charm, quote, consisted of the elegance and smoothness of its construction, end quote. And I think most modern readers would probably agree with him about that. It is extraordinarily beautiful in its sounds. Sappho was a consummate artist as to the use of alliteration, assonance, and the general musicality of her verses. It is part of what makes her poetry very difficult to translate. And I'll recite for you just the first stanza in the restored pronunciation of ancient Greek with its musical pitch accents and the quantitative rhythm of its meter that uses length of syllables and not stress, just to give you some sense of the sound of it. And incidentally, the meter that it is written is known as the Sapphic strophe, of course, named after her. The stanza consists of 3 long lines followed by 1 short line. You just listen to it, and even though you may not understand what it means, just let it roll over you. Poiché l'otro natanat Aphrodita, ae Dios doloplo che liso maise, me mais aesi medoni aesi damna, potniat humon. I think you can hear there that there's a lot of alliteration going on in there. There's a lot of assonance of the sounds. And now I'm just going to read for you a translation of the entirety of the poem. Iridescent throned Aphrodite, deathless child of Zeus, wile weaver, I now implore you, don't, I beg you, lady, with pains and torments crush down my spirit. But before, if you've heard my pleadings, then return as once you left your father's golden house. You yoked to your shining chariot your wing-wearing sparrows, skimming down the paths of the sky's bright ether. On they brought you over the earth's black bosom, swiftly. Then you stood with a sudden brilliance, goddess, before me. What I suffered, who was my cause of anguish? What would ease the pain of my frantic mind? And why had I called you to my side? And whom should persuasion summon here to soothe the sting of your passion this time? Who is now abusing you, Sappho? Who is treating you cruelly? Now he runs away, but he'll soon pursue you. Gifts he now rejects, soon enough he'll give them. Now he doesn't love you, but soon his heart will burn, though unwilling. Come to me once more and abate my torment. Take the bitter care from my mind, and give me all I long for, lady. In all my battles, fight as my comrade. Now, one point I want to make about this translation right away is that the sex of Sappho's beloved is not anything as clear in the Greek as I have had to make it in English. In this translation, I had to repeat the pronoun he several times in the penultimate stanza. Now he runs away, but soon he will pursue you, and so on. Because in English, you have to have a pronoun before you have a verb. You can't just say, now runs away, soon pursue. However, Greek does not use pronouns that way. It can use a separate word, but usually Greek just uses the verb. And so it is here that there is no pronoun here. And for those of you that speak another language, any of the European languages, you know that this is often the case. You can just simply say, hablamos español, and you know that it means we speak Spanish because of the ending that is there, as opposed to hablo español, which means I speak Spanish. You see, the ending is what gives away the pronoun. And there are separate words, but they don't have to be there. And here, there is no separate word. So the pronoun is simply the third person pronoun. It could be translated as he, as I have done, but it also could be translated as she, as I said, most modern translations would have it nowadays. But the fact of the matter is that the sex of the person that Sappho is beseeching Aphrodite to bring to her is not clear in any of those verbs. And it is only indicated by a single word in the entire poem, by a participle that is a kind of adjective that comes from a verb, meaning willing. The word is etheloisa, where in the translation, it says, soon his heart will burn, though unwilling. The Greek says, kouk etheloisa, even if unwilling. Okay. Unfortunately, however, the text is uncertain at this point. The manuscripts are damaged on this particular word. So the participle may not be etheloisa at all. In fact, that is a scholarly reconstruction first proposed in 1835 by a classicist named Theodore Bercht. But that reconstruction was not fully accepted until the 1960s, generally. And as late as 1955, that same scholar I mentioned before, Dennis Page, together with Edgar Lobel, who together made the first kind of the main edition of Sappho in the 20th century, they both noted that that reconstruction, they quote, they had, quote, without the least confidence in it, okay, end quote. So it is a conjectured participle in the feminine gender, but it could have been in the masculine originally, or it could have been in another word altogether. We simply don't know. There aren't even really, we aren't really entirely sure what it does say. So the one word in this complete poem, this one complete poem of Sappho, that indicates whether she is talking about a man or woman is uncertain. Now, I've gone with he, but I could be wrong. And that conjecture is, as I say, at total variance with the vast majority of translations nowadays that do go with she, but they could be wrong too. Now, getting past that point, because that ultimately is not the most interesting thing here. Let us delve into the poem itself. Notice what Sappho does not say. When she's asking for help in her, this person who does not love her back, and she asks Aphrodite for aid. And she uses explicitly military terminology, right? Come on your chariot, fight as my comrade. My sumokos, which is a distinctly military term. Notice that Sappho does not say, I am so emotionally bound up with this person that I cannot live without him. She does not say, this is my one and only true love. She says, come to me again. Help me this time. Be my comrade in all of my battles. Therefore, the image of Aphrodite swooping down from Mount Olympus to help her devotee, to cause the object of Sappho's desire to return that desire, is a very compelling image of the fickleness of romantic passion. And the idea, first of all, that romantic passion is an outside force imposed upon another individual that comes for a while and then goes away and leaves that person alone until the next time it comes around and infects them or assaults them, whatever metaphor you like to use. Again, Aphrodite and the feelings of romantic love are therefore capricious. Now, fascinatingly, this celebrated poem by Sappho is actually an echo with an intentionally jarring change of a passage in Homer's Iliad, which Sappho alludes to and makes the whole allusion to that section the basis of her poem. In verse 10 of Sappho's poem, she describes one of Aphrodite's former visits when she yoked her divine chariot and was brought by sparrows, that is, okeos struthoi. Now, throughout Homer's poems, but particularly the Iliad, chariots are drawn by swift horses, not sparrows, okees hippoi, that you see these two Greek phrases up on the top of your screen now. So what Sappho is doing is making a playful deviation from the standard phrase, which alerts her audience to a more extensive allusion, but also a more extensive elusive variation. And the unanimous verdict since Dennis Page has been that the scene which serves as Sappho's model is a scene from Book 5 of the Iliad, in which the Greek warrior Diomedes has an encounter with none other than the goddess Aphrodite herself. Let us now read that passage. But Aeneas, this is now the son of Aphrodite, but now a Trojan fighting against the Greeks in the Trojan War. But Aeneas leapt down with shield and long spear, seized with fear, lest perchance the Achaeans might drag from him the dead man. Over him he strode like a lion, confident in his strength, and before him he held his spear and his shield that was well balanced on every side, eager to slay the man whosoever should come to seize the corpse, and crying a terrible cry. But the son of Tydeus grasped in his hands a stone. This is now, the son of Tydeus is Diomedes, a mighty deed, one that not two men could bear, such as mortals now are. Yet lightly did he wield it even alone. Therewith he smote Aeneas on the hip, where the thigh turns in the hip joint, the cup men call it, and crushed the cup bone, and broke furthermore both sinews, and the jagged stone tore the skin away. So he smashes Aeneas's hip. Then the warrior fell upon his knees, and thus abode, and with his stout hand leaned he upon the earth, and dark night enfolded his eyes. And now would the king of men, Aeneas, have perished, had not the daughter of Zeus, Aphrodite, been quick to mark even his mother, that conceived him to Anchises as he tended his cattle. About her dear son she flung her white arms, and before him she spread a fold of her bright garment to be a shelter against missiles, lest any of the Danaans, that is the Greeks, with swift horses might hurl a spear of bronze into his breast and take away his life. She then was bearing her dear son forth from out of the battle. But the son of Capaneus forgot not the commands that Diomedes, good at the war cry, laid upon him. He held his own single-hooved horses away from the turmoil, binding the reins taut to the chariot rim, but rushed upon the fair-maned horses of Aeneas, and drove them forth from the Trojans into the host of the well-greaved Achaeans, and gave them to Deipolus, his dear comrade, whom he honored above all the companions of his youth, because he was like-minded with himself. Him he bade drive them to the hollow ships. Then did the warrior mount his own car, and take the bright reins, and straightway drive his stout-hoofed horses in eager quest of Tydeus' son. He the while had gone in pursuit of Cypris, that is Aphrodite, with his pitiless bronze. So now you have the son of Tydeus, Diomedes, chasing the mother of Aeneas, the goddess herself, Aphrodite, discerning that she was a weakling goddess, and not one of those that lorded in the battle of warriors. No Athena she, nor Enyo, sacker of cities. But when he had come upon her as he pursued her through the great throng, then the son of great-souled Tydeus thrust with his sharp spear, and leapt upon her, and wounded the surface of her delicate hand, and forthwith through the ambrosial raiment that the Graces themselves had wrought for her, the spear pierced the flesh upon the wrist above the palm, and forth flowed the immortal blood of the goddess, the ichor, such as floweth in the blessed gods, for they eat not bread nor drink flaming wine, wherefore they are bloodless and are called immortals. She then with a loud cry let fall her son, and Phoebus Apollo took him in his arms and saved him in a dark cloud. So and Apollo comes down and rescues Aeneas and gets him out of there, lest any of the Danaans, the Greeks, with swift horses might hurl a spear of bronze into his breast and take away his life. But over her shouted aloud Diomedes, good at the war cry, "Keep thee away, daughter of Zeus, from war and fighting. Sufficeth it not that thou beguilest weakling women? But if into battle thou wilt enter, verily methinks thou shalt shudder at the name thereof, if thou hearest it even from afar." So spake he, and she departed frantic, and was sore distressed. And wind-footed Iris took her, and led her forth from out of the throng, racked with pain. And her fair flesh was darkened. Anon, immediately, she found furious Ares, abiding on the left of the battle, and upon a cloud was his spear leaning, and at hand were his swift horses twain. Then she fell upon her knees, and with instant prayer begged for her dear brother's horses with frontlets of gold. Dear brother, save me, and give me my horses, that I may get me to Olympus. Where is the abode of the immortals? For surely am I pained with a wound which a mortal man dealt me, Tydeus' son, that would now fight even with Father Zeus. So spake she, and Ares gave her his horses with frontlets of gold. And she mounted upon the car, her heart distraught, and beside her mounted Iris, and took the reins in her heart. She touched the horses with the lash to start them, and nothing loath the pair sped onward. Straightway then they came to the abode of the gods, to steep Olympus, and there wind-footed swift Iris stayed the horses, and loosed them from the car, and cast before them food ambrosial. But fair Aphrodite flung herself upon the knees of her mother Dione. She clasped her daughter in her arms, and stroked her with her hand, and spake to her, saying, Who now of the sons of heaven, dear child, hath entreated thee thus wantonly, as though thou wert working some evil before the face of all? To her then made answer laughter-loving Aphrodite, Tydeus' son Diomedes high of heart wounded me, for that I was bearing forth from out of the war my dear son Aeneas, who is in my eyes far dearest of all men. For no longer is the dread battle won between Trojans and Achaeans, nay, the Danaans now fight even with the immortals. To her then made answer Dione, the fair goddess, Be of good heart, my child, and endure for all thy suffering. For full many of us that have dwellings on Olympus have suffered at the hands of men, in bringing grievous woes one upon the other. So suffered Ares, when Otis and mighty Ephialtes, the son of Aloeus, bound him in cruel bonds, and in a brazen jar he lay bound for 13 months. And then would Ares, insatiate of war, have perished, had not the stepmother of the sons of Aloeus, the beauteous Eriboea, brought tidings into Hermes, and he stole forth Ares, that was now sore distressed, for his grievous bonds were overpowering him. So suffered Hera, when the mighty son of Amphitryon smote her on the right breast with a 3-barbed arrow. Then upon her too came pain that might in no wise be assuaged. And so suffered monstrous Hades, even as the rest, a bitter arrow, when this same man, the son of Zeus that beareth the aegis, smote him in Pylos amid the dead, and gave him over to pains. But he went to the house of Zeus and to high Olympus with grief at heart, pierced through with pains. For into his mighty shoulder had the shaft been driven, and distressed his soul. But Paion spread thereon herbs that slay pain, and healed him. For verily he was in no wise of mortal mould. Rash man, worker of violence, that recked not of his evil deeds, seeing that with his arrows he vexed the gods that hold Olympus. And upon thee has the goddess flashing-eyed Athena set this man, fool that he is, for the heart of Tydeus' son knoweth not this, that verily he endureth not for long who fighteth with the immortals, nor do his children prattle about his knees when he is come back from war and the dread conflict. Wherefore now let Tydeus' son, for all he is so mighty, beware, lest one better than thou fight against him, lest in sooth Aegaleia, the daughter of Adrastus, passing wise, wake from sleep with her long lamentings all her household, as she wails for her wedded husband, the best man of the Achaeans, even she, the stately wife of horse-taming Diomedes. She spake, and with both of her hands wiped the ichor from the arm. The arm was restored, and the grievous pains were assuaged. Okay, now let us analyze the relationship between this text of Book 5 of the Iliad with Sappho 1. First of all, Sappho calls on her old ally Aphrodite, Zeus's daughter, in verse 2 of her poem, to be her ally, her symmachos, as we are told. That is a distinctly military term, a military ally. Once again, as she has been before, she asks her to be her ally, okay? And she says this before. She says this in verses 5 through 8. In the past, Aphrodite yoked her golden chariot. We read this in verses 8 through 9. The goddess then would depart from Olympus, as we read in verse 7, and fly through the middle of the air in verses 11 and 12. Now, Diomedes also calls upon one of Zeus's daughters in an earlier part that we did not read together. This is now book 5 of the Iliad, lines 115. Diomedes calls upon one of the daughters of Zeus with prayer to help him now as before. And this is in lines 115 through 119. We read, "Hear me, child of Zeus, that beareth the aegis." He's talking to Athena, though. "Unwearied one, if ever with kindly thought thou stoodest by my father's side amid the fury of battle, even so do thou now be likewise kind to me, Athena. Grant that I may slay this man, and that he come within the cast of my spear, that hath smitten me, or ever I was ware of him, and boasteth over me, and declareth that not for long shall I behold the bright light of the sun." Now, when Athena does come to battle, there is mention of her iridescent or dappled cloak. This is to be found in book 5 of the Iliad, lines 735, but it is exactly the same word as one reads in Sappho's poetry. But Athena, daughter of Zeus, that beareth the aegis, let fall upon her father's floor her soft robe, richly embroidered, or dappled, or iridescent. It's the same word of poikilon, that herself had wrought and her hands had fashioned, and put on her the tunic of Zeus, the cloud gatherer, and arrayed her in armor for tearful war. Okay. Now, Sappho describes how we saw before how in Sappho's description, Aphrodite comes down on her golden chariot, which is yoked to swift swans. But in the Iliad, we read that the swift chariot of Athena is yoked to swift horses, and on the end thereof she bound the fair golden yoke, cast thereon the fair golden breast straps, and Hera led beneath the yoke the swift-footed horses, and was eager for strife and the war cry. Okay, and here we see that same phrase of oikees, or at least the first part of that, the oikupodos hupus, that is the swift-footed horses. Okay, and then of course there is the departure from Olympus, just as there was in Sappho's poetry. Hera swiftly touched the horses with the lash, and self-bidden groaned upon their hinges the gates of heaven, which the hours had in their keeping, to whom are entrusted great heaven and Olympus, whether to throw open the thick cloud or to shut it. And then there is the same picturesque flight down from Olympus on her chariot of both Athena and, as we saw in Sappho, of Aphrodite. And this is in Iliad 5, lines 768 through 769. So now that is one level of the illusion, okay? The calling upon of a goddess, a daughter of Zeus, to help a person to be their ally, okay? Now, if this were the extent of the illusion, the integration of the literal object under consideration in Sappho, love, and the thing to which the illusion suggests some comparison in Homer, warfare, would be relatively simple. Love is a battle. Now, that's a pretty well-worn metaphor. And furthermore, what the two pieces of poetry would share in common, if that were it, would simply be a mere mortal in battle, one military, one romantic, seeking help from an ally goddess. That Diomedes, in this comparison, is therefore the analog of Sappho's persona, would either give her battle for love a more serious tone, an epic kind of splendor of combat and heroism, or more likely, it would add a certain amount of ironic perspective and humor even to Sappho's own form of quote-unquote warfare. But this metaphor of love, as I said, as warfare is certainly well-worn, and what makes Sappho's poetry and her allusion here more interesting than just that is that she adds a further layer of complexity to it. Because between Diomedes' first call to Athena and Athena's eventual appearance, Diomedes fights with and wounds Aphrodite herself, as we read in Iliad 5, 335 through 43. And therefore, there is an interpenetration or an entangling of the points of reference in Sappho's allusion. Moreover, in the secondary field, the Iliad, the wounded Aphrodite flees from the scene in a chariot. This is Iliad 5, 363 through 369. And she is drawn by horses, as we read, which fly her back to Olympus, and she seeks comfort from the goddess Dione, her mother, who asks her who is hurting her. That is, just to read the lines again, the goddess white-armed Hera failed not to hearken, but I'm sorry, we read that already. As we read in Sappho, the poem by Sappho, lines 19 through 20, Tis so Sappho adike, who wrongs you, Sappho? Okay, but those are exactly the same things that the goddess Dione, the mother of Aphrodite, says to Aphrodite in Iliad, lines 5, 373 through 4. So, as in the primary field of Sappho's poem, Aphrodite asks Sappho who is wronging her, so it is that now Dione in the Iliad is asking Aphrodite who is hurting you, who is wronging you. Thus, the normal tension between the literal object under consideration, love, and the thing to which the allusion suggests some comparison, war, has here been considerately complicated, considerately made more rich and interesting. Sappho is being helped by Aphrodite, and that is like Diomedes being helped by Athena. But Sappho, in being consoled by Aphrodite, is also like Aphrodite, wounded by Diomedes, and now being consoled by Dione. Sappho draws simultaneously on two connected points of comparison, which are part of a continuous narrative in her secondary field, the Iliad. To appreciate Sappho's scene, we as the audience must compare Diomedes' battle with Sappho's, and must conclude that the romantic struggle is different. It calls for different aid, you see. Diomedes calls for a war chariot to come down, drawn by swift horses. Sappho's love warfare must necessitate a sparrow-drawn chariot rather than a horse-drawn one. And as if to make sure the audience sees the significance of the gap, there is Aphrodite herself in the secondary field of the Iliad, trying to do military battle with Diomedes and failing miserably, with the implication being that she had better stick to the type of encounter where she is most skilled, namely romance, and leave bloody Homeric epic behind, coming to Sappho instead in lyric poetry. Forcing the audience to work from more than one point of view, therefore, and to see comparisons in multiple ways which reveal the complications of the problem under consideration, this is Sappho's great elusive game that she's playing here. It is a chosen method of hers and is to be found in other fragments of Sappho's poems as well. And just to kind of summarize it, the example of Sappho 1 and in its allusion to the Iliad is very significant in several respects. It combines allusion with imitation. In fact, the imitation of the common Homeric formula of the swift-footed horses versus the swift sparrows. As we have seen, that is the trigger for the illusion. But the use of Iliad 5 itself is even more complex and requires integrating multiple incidents from a long narrative in order to get the full benefit of the intention between the two fields. It is an illusion that goes beyond the direct and deliberate opposition of lyric poetry to Homeric epic and to the romantic ethos of lyric poetry to the martial ethos of epic. And this was an opposition that was standard during Sappho's time. It kind of characterizes lyric poetry of the 7th and 6th centuries, this opposition between lyric and epic. But Sappho's poetry plays with that opposition, and it seeks to draw a parallel, in some ways ironic and playful, perhaps in some ways serious, between the struggles of war and the struggles of romance. By way of conclusion, then, for our lecture in general, the last thing I want to look at in this lecture on Aphrodite is the way that she works as an example through which we can explore the question, which I am frequently asked by students, of whether the ancient Greeks actually believed in these gods or not. This strikes many modern people as a very crucial question about the religious system of the Greeks, And I would like to use Aphrodite as a means to discuss that question, to answer it maybe, because I think that she gives us a very good insight into the way in which that question is almost unaskable with this kind of God. With gods who are personifications of natural forces, the question of belief is not really a matter of debate. It is not something that comes up as it does on the shrill corners of YouTube or on Reddit. Aphrodite personifies and controls romantic passion. If we could sum up the whole position of it, if we could kind of sum up the whole question of whether or not the Greeks of the classical period, of the archaic period, of the 6th and 7th centuries BC, if they actually believed in Aphrodite, it would be tantamount to asking them, do you believe that there is such a thing as romantic passion? Tell me, do you think that that actually exists? And of course, the question would be ludicrous, and nobody would say no to it, because they would all say, yes, of course such a thing exists. Well, in a system like ancient Greek paganism, in which gods and goddesses like Aphrodite are personifications of natural forces to some degree, the question, do you believe in Aphrodite, is the equivalent of, do you believe in romantic passion? Do you think that that exists? It is a meaningless and silly question, because human experience tells us that such a thing exists. The question of whether personification is an appropriate way to represent these forces of nature, that is a question that can indeed be asked. As philosophy developed in Athens in the 5th century BC, in the 4th century BC, thinkers began to ask the question, is personification an appropriate way to represent these forces of nature? And the question of belief that is so crucial in our culture under the influence of 2,000 years of Christianity, that kind of question simply doesn't really apply in a polytheistic system such as we are dealing with among the ancient Greeks. Aphrodite is an excellent example of the irrelevance, not just the futility, but the irrelevance of expecting compassion, mercy, or pity from this kind of personified natural force. It is really just a question of the reality of human experience. We can all see, and we see it all the time in modern day culture. We can probably already see it even in our own lives, that romantic passion does destroy innocent lives sometimes. That it makes people commit many foolish acts. It makes people commit many sins and things that they regret. And therefore, it doesn't make any sense to look at a goddess like Aphrodite and expect mercy or compassion from such a deity, because it is a natural force that cannot grant those kind of things. If we were to look at some other gods that we're going to be examining more in the future, if we look at Dionysus, for instance, who is kind of in some ways a personification of alcohol, of wine. Wine, of course, can devastate and destroy innocent human lives. It is meaningless to ask Aphrodite to feel mercy or pity, just as it is meaningless to ask Dionysus to feel mercy or pity. Because can wine really show pity? Okay. These things, romantic passion and other natural forces, can destroy people, and they do destroy people, and they feel no compunction about that. That is what they are, that is what they do. That is the kind of entity that they are. And that means that the personification of these natural forces carries with it a certain kind of contradiction, that there is a certain kind of fundamental contradiction in this system. As sentient beings, Aphrodite, Dionysus, and all the rest of the Olympian gods ought to be able to feel pity, because they're described as anthropoi, right? As human beings. They're anthropomorphic. The fact that they cannot feel pity makes them in some sense less than human, not greater than human. Even though, of course, they are in other ways they are depicted as being more powerful, more beautiful, more intelligent, whatever, than human beings. In this regard, they are much, much less, much more sinister than human beings, because they cannot feel pity or compassion. And it is this contradiction, this sense that sentient beings should be able to feel pity, and yet, as personifications of natural forces, do not. This contradiction starts to be explored in some of the great literature of the 5th century BC, and in philosophy as well. And we will explore some of those developments in time. But for now, we will turn in our next lecture to the god Apollo. Thank you.